Hey everybody, Ed here with the Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share a quick update on my experience with the Sony Alpha A7 Mark II. This camera is priced at $16.99 for the body you're looking at here, $2,000 for the kit package if that's what you're after, and essentially this is the latest addition to the Alpha lineup of full-frame mirrorless interchangeable lens cameras from Sony. It is based around the E-mount, has a 24 megapixel sensor, essentially the exact same one found in the original A7. There has been a redesign. This body is full magnesium, no polycarbonates really employed here whatsoever. The lens mount itself is now full stainless steel, so a complete departure from, again, the polycarbonate or plastic feel found in the previous generation A7. They've changed the battery compartment bay door. The actual SD card door as well has gotten smaller. This is all still weather sealed, has Wi-Fi, NFC, video record button right there. Position has pretty much stayed the same, but really the camera has just gotten bigger. We have a larger grip. We have a shutter button that's been relocated from basically on the top of the body to the grip itself, where it probably should have been all along. But the key feature, the most important element of this camera, is its 5-axis image stabilization system. This is a system that is groundbreaking. While other manufacturers, Pentax, Olympus, do have similar systems in play, none are of this nature, and none come in at this sort of price point with a full frame sensor to boot. Now remember, even though it is that same 24 megapixel sensor found in the original A7, it has been improved, same Bions X processor as the A7, but now with the algorithms employed from the A6000, Sony's fastest focusing mirrorless interchangeable lens camera, which of course is APS-C, not full frame. They've used those algorithms to get a 30% performance boost in terms of autofocus speed, and then 50% boost in the actual tracking performance. And that's really big for the A7 line. Not as big, of course, though, as that image stabilization. So let's talk about that image stabilization and what it does for this camera. So for those of you that are new to the Alpha lineup, essentially with the E-mount, you can put any piece of glass with an adapter on here that you want. You can do that with any E-mount or any X camera from the past. You usually had to give up autofocus unless you were using a Sony A-mount lens and were pairing it with one of Sony's own adapters, which actually had, or at least the last generation does, a full autofocus system built into it, basically replacing the system being used on camera. Not something that was ideal, but a good bridge. Sony knew that many photographers loved what they had built in the Alpha lineup, but there were things missing. One of those being the image stabilization, which had been reserved to be on lens. And a good example of that, some very expensive glass like this, the 24-70 Zeiss FE lens, full frame E-mount lens. It does have, optical stabilization, and that's something you absolutely pay for beyond just the Zeiss name and the performance of the lens itself. The same applies to the 70-200G piece of glass, also another FE lens. Even this SEL lens, which is designed for APS-C, also has stabilization, and look at how small this wide-angle 10-18, again, APS-C lens is, that just happens to work in full-frame mode. So there are a lot of different lens options. Even this little 20mm f2.8 lens, of course it's APS-C, but it would work on this in crop mode, and it would take advantage of all 5-axis image stabilization, the complete system that this has to offer. But when it comes to Canon, Nikon, Legacy, third-party glass, then it's all about what information that adapter that you're using with that lens can communicate directly to the A7 Mark II. So essentially, if it can communicate both the focal distance as well as the length distance, then it's able to actually work with all 5 levels of stabilization. However, if it cannot give that combination of information to the A7 Mark II, which is what Sony has designed it to essentially respond to, then you're going to end up with 3-axis stabilization. Now, that's not a bad thing by any means. That's still pretty much unheard of in the business, especially for Sony. Again, this is the first body to ever have stabilization, which meant before not only were you full manual, but you were also essentially, hopefully, on a tripod, and now you don't need to be. And if you're working with native Sony lenses, up to a 4-stop improvement or gain with this image stabilization. That means in low light situations, but more so general situations where you would have had to be on a tripod, you will not need to be, and that is just game changing in the DI world in terms of actual productivity, usability, and what we've come to expect. And Sony's been very good at that with their mirrorless game. They really have changed expectations for quality and form factor, and now even functionality. Hopefully the next step is that autofocus speed, which is improved here, and I can say it has been, but not tremendously, not as much as we would like to see. But keep in mind, this is the baseline for Sony's full-frame Mark II refresh. With regard to video, they did also pump things up. We've got XAVCS now, no 4K video, but 50 megabits is a lot better than 28, at least on paper, that is. In my experience so far, video coming out of this has not looked great. I don't know if they need to do something in firmware. I've played with all of the different modes, meaning 24p, 60p, it doesn't matter. It really comes down to video just is not clean, and that likely is software, hopefully something that can be treated at the firmware level. But of course, as always, I'm going to tell you the truth regarding how things perform, and video is the one area where I am surprised with the Mark II because I really had high expectations with that 5-axis image stabilization. Even though I know it's predominantly designed to deal with still imaging, Sony does market it as being rather an advantage for video as well, at least with regard to shutter roll, the effect, and just roll in general, left to right with the camera. I'm not seeing that. I'm seeing more artifacts and less clean video than I've seen from previous gen gear from them. And that's surprising, especially since this employs the same Bionz X processor. So weird to see a drop-off there. Maybe it's a sign of trying to push us into a more expensive video-centric Mark II, but still, I expect better results, and hopefully that will improve. Now, with regard to the weather sealing, the body just got bigger, heavier, better built overall, bigger grip. That means that you're going to feel comfortable one-handing this camera with larger lenses than any other A7 in the past. Just for reference, you can see the thickness difference here, quite a bit. Even though it's only 5 ounces on paper, it's really a lot when you look at physical. And then when you look at the bottom, look at the difference in the mounting base plate there. I mean, on the left in the Mark II, it's literally twice the size. So Sony clearly acknowledging in the ergonomics of the grip redesign itself, which you can see here as well, that this is all about taking on heavier glass, being more comfortable with that bigger system that this camera really does represent in terms of power capability, even though it is much smaller than its DSLR counterparts that you would traditionally look to for this sort of quality. But then also, still maintaining a form factor that's at least close to the original Alpha line, but certainly much larger in just about every area. It's thicker, heavier, and that's not a bad thing. I think most users that pick it up for the first time are going to love the way this camera feels. Again, the movement of the power and shutter button to the front of the actual camera, I think, is great. I think it's overall an improvement in every single way except for video. The display, the screen, the 3-inch panel at the back articulates in the exact same motion as the A7R. No self-portrait capability, but we do have a bump up in the dot count, over 1 million as opposed to the 921,000. Do I see a real difference? Not really, but not a bad thing for them to do that, in my opinion. Also, the menu buttons, all of the buttons at the top have been relocated because now we've got a completely different, essentially, body. Even though it looks a lot like the old body, there's this whole lip here that didn't really exist for button layout, at least on the previous gen. You can see the buttons were actually flush on the housing itself. They weren't on a step-down curved angle like they've been built on here. So Sony really maximizing the body for more function, more customizable buttons. Everything speaks to improvements for, professionals and enthusiasts that really wanted a camera that wasn't going to be a backup. They wanted this to legitimately be able to replace that Canon or Nikon or even Alpha A-mount Sony camera that they'd been using for so many years, relying on that brand. Sony wanted to be able to give you everything that you needed, and I think they listened to most of those consumers. The front and back dials here that are plastic, they still have a really solid feel. They're tight, but I really preferred the metal ones on the previous generation. That's just personal preference. I would in no way take those metal dials on the previous gen over the new ones when you take into account all of the improvements here between the 5-axis, the build quality, the grip comfort, and XAVCS, once hopefully video gets, I hope it can be figured out, will be a great advantage for this. Would I love to see 4K? Of course, but it's just not there yet. The actual bay doors, I can tell you, some people thought these were a godsend, far superior to the previous gen design. I think they're a little bit more difficult to deal with personally, but when it actually comes to setting up a rig, if you are using this for video professionally or shooting a documentary, whatever it may be, for any sort of paid work or school for that matter, this orientation is better than the previous gen, which just had the two doors side by side, keeping things up top. Definitely, I think, a little bit more flexible overall. And also, these doors do feel more solid than the previous gen. But otherwise, the mode dial, exposure comp, nothing new there at all. But these buttons, completely new. They didn't exist there, and that's because we do have more programmable custom buttons now. There are 4 rather than 3, and 2 of them are right here comfortably waiting for you to basically assign to whatever you want. That function button will take you right into quick function on anything you want to do with the camera, from the automatic modes that are available to scene modes, or to actual capabilities when you're in something more manual and want to actually take full control of what you're going to do with your camera, which is what Sony is after, of course, with this model especially. So the A7, a great starting point. The Mark II really taking that and I think putting a professional touch on it that Sony felt was missing from the first gen. I like everything that I've seen here. The Wi-Fi and NFC I haven't played with that much because I already know what to expect. The Play Memory Store does give you applications that no other manufacturer on the market really has addressed in the same fashion Sony has, and that's because they've been after it for quite some time. Time-lapse, things like that come standard in some cameras for free. Sony charges you. Some will argue the application here is better. Others will say it's worse. At the end of the day, I think more options just equates to a better experience. So it's better to have a Play Memory Store with apps to buy and shop and see development for than not to have one at all. And it is there, and of course direct control can be taken of this camera with your Android or iOS device using the Play Memories app. And when it comes to glass, again, you've got great flexibility inside Sony's very own E-mount system, whether you want to go native with something like this, the Zeiss 24-70 f4, which is an expensive piece of glass, and many would argue you're better off going with the kit glass, and I understand why. They're speaking specifically to price-performance ratio, the difference not being great enough to justify the extra cash that the Zeiss name demands. But you can also, of course, use a lot of APS-C glass. Like I mentioned before, the wide angle, as I give that a shot, the wide angle lens I have right here works great with it. I mean, granted, it is designed for APS-C and not full frame, which basically every other APS-C lens you're going to use with this is going to crop or be forced into a crop mode. You can try using it in full frame, but it'll basically destroy the capture frame of the image on the sensor. Here, you do actually have a range. For those of you that haven't seen my video, there is a sweet spot where full frame does work. So there are smaller lenses that will still maintain the form factor of this body, even though it has gotten larger. So there's a lot to like about the Mark II, a lot of innovations, the 5-axis being the biggest Video performance, hopefully eventually another great addition. The ergonomics, and I think are a critical change for pros. But again, the 5-axis is really where it's at. The extra resolution on the display, negligible. The actual electronic viewfinder, to me, basically about the same also in terms of performance, at least from what I can see right now. The extra customizable buttons, again, a bonus. I don't think anyone's going to be upset with that. And the bigger, beefier build at the end of the day is going to lead to, I think, a more durable camera, and one that's going to not only last longer, but play better with those bigger, more expensive lenses that Sony has roadmapped for the next 2 years, even beyond what they've made public so far. So I think if you want to be ready for a full investment in the FE lineup, the FE lenses that Sony has to offer, the Mark II is a definite win right now. Of course, if you can wait, I think at CES we'll see a higher end, a refresh of the R, or maybe an A9, which may play to a bigger advancement over the A7. I mean, if you're talking about whether or not you should upgrade from the A7 to the Mark II, that's a tough question to answer, because even though you got that slight boost in autofocus speed and tracking from the algorithms from the A6000, and you also have the 5-axis, which is the biggest bragging right, the video performance wasn't a real big jump. And I think that, especially with the way these bodies unfortunately depreciate, if you give it a little bit of time, this camera will be less expensive, and the newer bodies will get announced. And that'll just put you in a more flexible position to make a choice that's going to be best suited for what you actually need, both in terms of still and video capability and overall flexibility. I mean, it has been true to its 350 shots, or excuse me, 40 shots of battery life, basically the same as the previous gen. And that's another reason for me to say that the previous gen is still completely competent. So if you're wondering which is better, it's really how much do you care about the extra grip? Get one of these in your hands, feel it. Are you comfortable with your hand, gripping this camera for long periods of time? You're not going to be able to tell in a store, but I think almost every user is going to prefer the feel of the Mark II over the previous gen. The rest of the weight issue really is going to be a matter of personal preference. I would still like to see Sony keep the cameras lighter, but if it's a matter of technical necessity with regard to engineering to match the lens spec, because that's where the FE lenses are all going, and they've made a bit of an error in the first gen and they're correcting it now, then I fully support the extra weight. But if this is just to palliate Nikon and Canon users who have been waiting to cross over, and yes, the image stabilization should be the reason, but for a lot of them it's also been that they want something that is a lot more to grab onto. Sony certainly has done that here. It's not really something that I'm in love with. It is more comfortable. Again, the ergonomics are better, but the E-mount has always been about getting the best performance in the smallest form factor, and Sony seems to be giving up some of that, again, unless, of course, the lenses are going to get smaller because they will no longer require optical stabilization. However, I don't see that in the roadmap, so as much as I want to believe that, I'm not so sure that that's where things are going. I would have loved to have seen 4K video. That's not even rumored to be in the A9 or refresh of the A7R. So don't get your hopes up for that. After all, the A7S just launched, and that is their 4K mirrorless interchangeable full frame for now. No update to the VG900, no update to the RX1 or RX1R. So clearly the emphasis is on the refresh of the A7 lineup, and hopefully we'll see some 4K video. That's what I'm really waiting for personally. I want internal capture, especially if the body got this much larger. I think Sony can definitely figure out a way to deal with the heat, since that, I believe, is the biggest problem when it comes to 4K video capture on these full-frame mirrorless little beasts. Any questions or comments, please feel free to post them. And of course, as usual, please feel free to subscribe. Later.